question we'll be having will be quite more practical, because that's I think that's what is the bane of board effectiveness, the challenges. So, in your view, I'll first of all ask Dr. Ewelukwa, in your view, what are the challenges to board effectiveness? Because you have a peculiar experience being the general counsel, as a company secretary for like I think 8 years, then the CEO. So you're a strong board player. Most times, sometimes company secretaries, I don't know why some of them don't view themselves as if they are part of the board, but in your view, what do you think are the challenges to board effectiveness? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a number of things that can constitute challenges to the effectiveness of a board of directors. And in a lot of instances, I think it kind of stems from having what I call foundational errors. Foundational errors include where a board operates without a board charter. And so you don't have a clear delineation of responsibilities between the board and the directors. You don't have clear delineation of responsibilities amongst the board committees. So it becomes a mess, because people nature abhors a vacuum. And so what you find is people simply scrambling without any clear order, purely because it didn't occur to somebody to clearly define these things in a document, so that board members know clearly what the remit, what they're empowered, what they're authorized to do, what the chairman is authorized to do, the delineation of responsibility between the board and the management. And of course, it's the board charter that even defines things like quorum. Okay, so if you don't have a clear definition of quorum, then you can have a factionalized board where 2 or 3 members can take decisions that they consider binding on the company. So there's need for challenges include lack of clarity in the roles and responsibilities of the board members, the chairman, the management, and where the lines are drawn. The one I would also touch on include where there is a poor follow-up in between board meetings. And so what you find, and that also kind of touches on the role of the company secretariat, because the company secretary has a critical role in making sure, first of all, that the minutes properly capture all the things that are decided at meetings. The minutes are circulated well not too long after the meeting, the board has held the meeting, so that the board members still have fresh recollection of the things discussed at the meeting. And then, of course, the matters arising from meetings. And so a board cannot be effective. Mr. Adebayo touched on the issue of receiving a bulky document just before, maybe on the eve of a meeting, you receive a 300-page document. Now, a board that functions like that would not be able to take effective decisions, not because the members do not want to, but because there is a gap in how the board functions, how the board is served by the company secretariat. It is the company secretariat that should ensure that such things don't happen, that documents are provided way in advance of meetings. It is some company secretariat that take the lead in preparing the diary, in terms of the schedule of board meetings for the year. So other things, of course, include conflict of interest, where you have board members that are also interested in in the work of the company, or maybe through multiple directorships. You may find some boards where the board member also has interest in some other company that may even be in competition with the company where he's sitting on as a board, or where he has access to privileged information that can be used in some other board. So things like that can impact on board effectiveness. I'd already touched on the issue of lack of diversity in the in the board where you don't have a fair balance of skills, experiences, competencies, that also would impact on board effectiveness. Again, a board that is aloof, that leaves the management sort of almost running on their own, that is a problem that would impact on because what it means is that the board has really somewhat abdicated its responsibility. You look at one of the points I touched on earlier, where the issue of overbearing influence. The rule is that even as a board member, whatever it is you may have done in your, whatever it is that, a board is a meeting point for all kinds of people. This person may be an ex-cabinet member. This person may be minister. This other person may be just an independent director. But if you're entering a board meeting, you leave your ego at the door. If you walk into a board meeting with your ego fully intact, then you're going to have problems. You're going to have personality clashes that impact on how the board functions. And so these are some of the things that can affect how a board works. And of course, within the public service space, I also worked with as a company within government. There are different experiences of how boards interface with the supervising ministry, okay? And in some ways, it depends on the two things, I would say. The nature of the minister in question. There may be, you have some ministers that may be overbearing, okay? That do not necessarily understand that a company that has a board is not like a unit in the ministry or a department in the ministry, but there is a board also put together by the president to oversee the company. It also depends on the personality of the CEO or the management of such a company or the board itself. So where the board has like a strained relationship with the supervising ministry, it can cause a big problem because it can paralyze decision making, particularly where there are some ministers on the board itself, and maybe the ministers are dragging with the board on something or the other. So a poor relationship in that context can have a very big problem. I would also note finally about the importance of onboarding of board members properly. And so the onboarding process is very important because that is where you set the tone for why the board was created. And so, again, in the public space, people get appointed to boards for different reasons, different considerations. So in the typical company, it is the shareholders that select the board. But in the public sector, sometimes that can be different, right? Where you have kind of board members because of some reason or the other, they get appointed to the board. And so that onboarding process is very, very important. It's at the onboarding process that you can even determine whether there are knowledge gaps on the board, whether there's need for, in addition to the briefing the board, is there need, for instance, for structured training of board members? Is there need for board retreats where certain issues can be looked at in more depth? There are things you cannot effectively cover in the course of a single board meeting, but perhaps if you have a board retreat that spans 3-4 days, you can go into deeper depth, and so that the board members actually understand the company they are manning. So in a nutshell, all these things they feed into the effectiveness of a board. And where you have a gap in any of them, then that board will have issues, and by extension, the company itself would also have issues.
Thank you so much. That was that's a very big one. And for me, based on what you just said, I will term this as deal breakers because all these things can be avoidable. It's not like that is just one of those things that happen. So no board charter, poor follow up. So there are questions, but let's just allow. We already have 2 questions already, and Temitayo, just give us time. Just hold on. Let Mr. Adebayo speak to the the challenges. Then we'll now take the questions. Please just hold on, Temitayo. Thank you. So over to you, briefly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Obi and Doctor. Again, it felt like the doctor was reading from my notes, so I wouldn't I wouldn't add too much on that. I think the one thing I would say though, and I think which is what is being represented in the questions, you also need to understand the cultural dynamics of the space where the board is operating. So I was chair of values and ethics in a previous role. And that role was a very important role because as chair, I saw cases that were brought forward of board member or senior management misconduct or not misconduct. Misconduct would sound like there were episodes of fraud, but there were just incidents of maybe where some of those individuals they showed bias in their decision making. Yeah. So it wasn't extreme, like nobody stole money or anything, but maybe a senior leader made a decision and other leaders or other members of the organization felt like there was some bias or compromise, or the decision was made based on a lack of full knowledge and information. That sort of matter came to the values and ethics committee, and we reviewed it, and we spoke and made a decision on the matter. So that was sort of what that role was. And I think it was a very key role considering that was in a public sector board. That was when I sat with a council in my previous role. Again, if you think about the cultural dimension, some of the questions being asked are around the experience of some of the board members that sit in maybe public sector roles. I imagine in Nigeria is where some of those respondents are. I don't think there is an equivalent mechanism in my mind. I'm happy for someone to speak up where there is truly a mechanism for saying this person sits on the board and they've done one or two things, which maybe they could have done better. I'm not sure what the mechanisms are for that challenge. Albeit you think it is important to have that sort of mechanism. Those mechanisms exist in the spaces that I have worked. So that's the only comment I'll make. Overall, the point I'm trying to make is we also need to be switched on to the cultural nuances of the spaces and the environments where the different boards that we are either connected to or we sit on sit, because you need to understand the cultural dimension to these things. Thank you. But otherwise, every other thing Doctor said, I totally agree with 100%.
Thank you so much. That's so important. The culture is so key. The way people do things. You're surprised in the boardroom, it just be playing out. And that is the questions we are having here. So Doctor, some of these questions are directed to you. So let me just read out the two. I'm sure you've already seen that. The one on the supervising ministry. Can you just briefly speak to that, very briefly, because you already said something about it. So briefly, because that is what we see happening in our country, that's rendering the boards ineffective. Thank you. Briefly.
Well, within the government space, sometimes that comes up as a problem, and it typically depends on the personalities of the supervising ministers, as well as the personalities on the board of directors. Sometimes, of course, the minister is also the chair of the board. So in such an instance, it's still important for the board for the minister to recognize that the company is not a unit within the ministry. If the government had intended that this company would be a unit in the ministry, then they wouldn't have appointed a board of directors for the company. But the fact that there is a board also appointed by the president means that there's some understanding within the government system that due to the nature of the work of the company, that it needs an independent set of eyes from the ministry to oversee its work. Now, of course, where the conflicts arise, it requires wisdom to manage, okay? Because ultimately, the fundamental purpose of setting up the company must be achieved. And so it can be a difficult environment if that situation is not well managed in terms of the minister, the board, the management of the company. But wisdom is profitable to direct. And so in such an instance where there are conflicts, the first thing is to determine what is causing the conflict. What may be causing the conflict may be the point I noted earlier, where there's a fundamental lack of understanding of where the lines are drawn. Within government, there is I know, for instance, that within the Nigerian government, there's a manual or, from the secretary to government that sets out the rules of boards. So there's a board manual that basically makes it clear that boards are not to supplant management, okay? It also kind of sheds light on the division between the ministry and the board. And so, but of course, manuals are not self-enforcing. Ultimately, it's still human beings that implement manuals. And so even whether you have a board charter, whether you're using the government clarification, is still important for the board members to exercise wisdom in engaging the ministry. Because if you're too focused on, we are the board, we are different from the ministry, it doesn't quite work, because you may find out tomorrow there are some critical approvals that the company requires from the ministry. And then so you may start having constraints that are completely avoidable. And so it's still about wisdom in conflict management. Conflicts have existed from the beginning of the world. And ultimately, what resolves conflict is wisdom. And so the wisdom, of course, is an undefined element that if you see it, you recognize it. And so in the same way, it's like somebody asking, what if there's a conflict between husband and wife? You don't find it, the answer to that is not documented in any manual. It's documented in wisdom. And so as long as wisdom prevails, and as long as the parties recognize the fundamental reason why they are there to advance the best interest of the company, then it should be possible within that context to evolve how they manage that conflict so that it doesn't adversely impact the company.
Thank you very much. I think that that was a wise answer, because this is a situation where you have people that are not acting as fiduciaries in the board. That is when you have this kind of situation. Like Mr. Adebayo said, if the people are, if the culture is right, if there's an ethical culture, you won't have this kind of difficulty. But when the culture is not, is unbalanced, some people are ethical, some people are not, and then maybe the people that have higher hand, maybe the board chair or the CEO, are the unethical ones, then you just need wisdom to be able to do your work. So thank you for that insight. Then there's another question here that's talking about, I'll give that to Mr. Adebayo. Please make it very brief. When we have from Okoro, when we have seen situations where some boards compromise proxies. Sorry, some boards comprise proxies that lack depth in knowledge, experience, especially in that organization's area of expertise. What options are left if you find yourself in such a board and want to be careful not to offend those who appointed them?
So that's a very interesting one. And I think it's an extension of the conversation we just had around applying wisdom. But if you permit me, Obi, there's a question after that that speaks to gender diversity and board membership. I believe one of the mitigations for that problem is ensuring a diverse board. Yeah. We talked earlier about the depth of skill and knowledge that is expected in individuals that sat around our board table. Sometimes we get it right, whether for different reasons, including, having proxies sat around the table sometimes. I think as long as we're solving as a board, as a whole, rather than individuals, it will compensate sometimes. So having the right diversity around the table sometimes help bridge that gap. That's one thing. Regarding whether or not you cause offense, personally, I don't have a problem with causing offense respectfully. Yeah, those are two different things. We shouldn't conflate. It is the role of the board. If you're on the board and you're not causing offense, I doubt you are doing your job right. Yeah. So, so you need to get comfortable with offense as a leader, as a board member. But there are ways to do it. You can cause offense with respect. Yeah. You can ask the right questions respectfully. You can challenge respectfully. I think as a board, or as a member of a board, it is our responsibility to ask those difficult questions. But then again, if you are backed by a diverse board, I think those would also come to your aid, because you want a board that has people with the right, again, so there are layers to it. All those things we've talked about all day: diversity, ethics, integrity, all those things come into the mix. Yeah. And that's why it's important you have the right people sat around the table. So, but the key takeaway is, let's us run this table. I assume we're all leaders here. I assume we're all one way or the other connected to boards. I think the key message I would say in response to that is, we need to start getting comfortable with causing offense as leaders. Respectfully, if we're not having those sort of difficult conversations, then sometimes maybe we're not doing our job right. I hope that helps somebody.
Yes, that is so key. If you're not ready to cause offense, you're not doing your work well. But you have to offend with respect. So that's a very good answer to that question. And because of our time, the question on diversity from Professor Febu has already been answered by you indirectly by saying that gender diversity helps to promote board effectiveness. So, Dr. Ewelukwa will just speak on that gender, because I agree that during the course of the event, we didn't really mention gender. So please, you speak to that very briefly, and also take this question. And someone is asking whether the recording will be shared. Yes, it will be shared. It will be shared, and when it's ready, we will share it to those that registered, if you have your email. So if you don't have your email and you want to get the recording, just drop your email on the chat. Thank you. So Dr. Ewelukwa, you also take this other question from Dame Onome. There are situations where the majority shareholder is the MD of the company. He now handpicks his friends as chairman and other directors. You are now representing the minority. You're now representing the minority shareholders, but decisions are taken and teleguided by the MD, who owns majority stake. Most decisions are not in the best interest of the company. What would you advise the minority director to do, as there are always disagreements and conflicts? But other directors support the MD at all times because he picked them. And the majority vote will have its way. This happens in a lot of small company boards and affects the overall performance at the end of the day. So, sir, what do you say to this?
Thank you very much. First of all, the it's very important to have a diverse board and particularly proper gender balance. I recall the first board meeting we had at Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading PLC under the leadership of then Honorable Minister of Finance, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is now, of course, the DG of the WTO. And she made that point at that first board meeting of August 2011, that it was important to have gender balance, not just at the board level, but also at the management level. And the truth is that you find competent hands in amongst males and amongst females. And so it also enriches the quality of perspectives on the board. So it is something that is absolutely important to ensure that there's appropriate representation, not just at the board level, but the board, since the board also hires the management of the company, particularly at the high level, the board should also ensure diversity at senior management level and also provide guidelines to management in recruiting lower level staff to ensure that gender balance is maintained in hiring in the company, even in procurement as well, so that generally the company is seen to be sensitive to its operating environment, to the point that Mr. Adebayo raised earlier. You need to be culturally sensitive, you need to be gender sensitive, to ensure that the company at any point in time is adequately representing its operating environment. The second question raised regarding oppression of the minority. Within company law, there are rules for protecting minority shareholders, particularly without making reference to any specific provision, but I know that there are rules that circumstances under which minority shareholders can even petition for winding up of a company, by that we are being oppressed. And so what is important is making sure that that oppression is well documented. For instance, do they avoid inviting you to board meetings, etc.? When you attend meetings and your views are not taken on board, is it properly captured in the minutes of the meeting? Because ultimately it's about evidence. When the majority has its way, the fundamental question still remains whether the decisions of the board are in line with the core business, core objectives of the company. So if the decisions of the board are in line with, in law, we talk about the view of a reasonable person. A reasonable person, because by the time it winds up as litigation, the judge is a third party who wasn't there when the company was set up. And so it's all about evidence. A reasonable person looking at the minutes of the board meeting in terms of the decisions taken by the board and weighing that against the reason for setting up the company, will the person come to an objective conclusion that the board is not acting in the best interest of all the shareholders? So it really, when you're in that sort of oppressive environment, it ultimately and wise counsel does not prevail. Because remember what I said about wisdom. Wisdom is very, very important. The two things that are critical in managing board relationships are psychology and chemistry. You must understand psychology, you must understand chemistry. If you're not a discerning person, if you are not good in reading people, if you cannot read a room, then you can be having conflicts that are avoidable. But if you're a very discerning person, if you are, I would even mention a quality that sometimes is used in religious context, but I found it very useful within board context: humility. Okay, because it allows you to kind of see things. Humility allows you to not take offense easily. Let me put it that way. So if you're a humble person, if you're a discerning person, if you're somebody that understands boardroom chemistry, if you're somebody that has a basic grasp of human psychology, even in an oppressive context, you may still be able to figure out, how do I navigate this environment? Now, except you're dealing with a situation where the majority members are simply evil and are bent on killing the company or ensuring adverse outcomes for the company. But it may simply be that by the time you study this situation, it may be that there are one or two strong characters that you need to figure out how you manage. And if you can manage these one or two strong characters, then they can influence every other person. And so but in the extreme case where every other thing has failed, then you may now have to pursue the legal route of pursuing the winding down of the company, but it's a tortuous process that requires hard paying attention to evidence as early as possible. So by the time it gets to litigation, you have already amassed your irrefutable evidence supporting your position. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I'm very grateful for the legal perspective you put in, because most times, especially for us in Nigeria, I'm sorry to say, sometimes we forget about our legal rights and we just act as victims. So that's very educative. So the minority shareholders, you have a right. You can use you can exercise your rights and petition. And in these days, there's a lot of shareholder activism. So it's shareholders, even in the general meeting, people have to be exercise their rights. So thank you for that question, and thank you for the way you answered it. So the final question before we close, I would like to give that to Mr. Adebayo. Sorry, it was a question, a follow-up question. So as you have been a chair of a subcommittee, ethics, values and ethics. So from our discourse today, one of the things that is ringing in my head clear is the need for ethical culture in boards, because the culture really plays a lot of role on the output of the board. So how can we create or influence the culture to become ethical? I know this is a topic on its own, but I want to just get a brief insight.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question, but it's a pertinent one. Again, organizational individual culture is driven by the wider environment. Yeah. So it's important we bear that in mind. But that said, I strongly believe in organizations, ethics, values are driven by the tone from the top. Yeah. Again, as leaders, what behaviors do we demonstrate? What what values do we demonstrate? How do we show fairness? How do we show justice? How do we demonstrate these behaviors? Because by the example, truth be told, we know in Nigeria, we watch leadership. A few years ago, the leader, this is a real observation, and I'm sure some of you here would even agree with me. I'm regularly in Nigeria. A few years ago, there was a different leader in government from a different part of Nigeria. It was an observation to me, and I'm sure to many other people, when I walked into government, civil service, a lot of people dressed like they were from a part of the country, because the president and chief executive was that part of the country. That the dressing was popular. It was common. A lot of people were wearing Hausa hats, and But you notice that when the the leader of the nation changed, in the trips I've had since, that sort of dressing isn't as popular anymore. A lot of people are now dressing like that from the western part of Nigeria. It might sound very fickle, but those things, they trickle down, even in our subconscious. Yeah. So I think, to answer your question, it starts with leadership. It starts with, again, the board, senior leadership, those demonstrating. There is real ethics, and then there is the perception of ethics. Let's even start with the perception of ethics. Yeah. Let's start with just showing fairness, showing justice, showing that intention to be ethical in our behaviors. And I think indeed it will trickle down. The second order, like you say, it's a wider conversation, but then there are elements there around how do you measure, what are the mechanisms for punishment might seem harsh, but what are the consequences for not being ethical? You know, if I don't do the right thing, what does it matter? Yeah. Am I even better off for not doing the right thing? Again, those conversations, those things need to be looked at in the round. But I think if I was to leave us with one thing today, in my experience, it starts with that tone at the top. So as a group of leaders, as a group of individuals associated with boards or sitting on boards, it's very important that starting in perception and then moving into reality, we show ourselves to be ethical people. I think that's the best way to go about it, to start.
Thank you so much. So the thing is, on our personal levels, that's what I hear you say. Let's begin to show fairness. Let's begin to show justice. And like from the people that registered, from what I see, most people have some connections with the board or are in the board. So we're encouraging you, us all, wherever we are, let us begin to shine that light of ethics, and it will gradually permeate to others. And yes, leadership is set, the tone is set at the top. So gradually, we have to do the right thing. And so I'm just going to do a wrap up now because we'll soon be out of time. I'm going to do a wrap up, and I want to thank Dr. Ewelukwa and Mr. Adebayo for making out time to join us from the UK. We are so very grateful. And I also want to thank all the people that joined, all the participants, and for the enlightening questions that were asked. Thank you, everyone. So some of the takeaways, like what Dr. Ewelukwa said, if you have an ego, when you're entering the boardroom, just drop it at the door. And like what Mr. Adebayo said, culture is from the outside. The outside environment influences culture, so we should not allow that to influence us negatively, especially when we have a seat at the board. Then the KPIs, the major KPIs, so that we do not forget, major KPIs for board effectiveness. Look away from the board administrative functionings or operations. Look at the externalities. What are the people saying? What are the regulators saying? That will help you to measure your performance. Look at your internal audits and your financial audit reports. What are they saying? That will help you measure your performance. Your compliance. That's already measuring your performance. It means that some decisions are not right. It means some policies are not right. Then when we talk about the critical success factors, and we talked about diversity, Mr. Adebayo pointed out diversity, and we have seen it reoccurring, echoing in all the discussions, diversity of the board. Diversity is key. That's something, if you're in a board, that is something you must get right. Critical success factor, diversity. You have clarity is another thing that rings true. Clarity, there must be clarity. There must be clarity, and then there must be quality information and communication, which can be flexible and not just around formalities. So clarity, those are critical success factors. And then mechanism for performance assessment. Those are critical success factors. And then when we talked about characteristics of the board, of an effective board. Dr. Ewelukwa talked about respect. A board that has respect, I would like to call it like respect for other people's view, empathy. That's the characteristic of an effective board. And then a board that meets regularly. You don't always send representatives. That's another point. And a board that always has its purpose in sight. That also speaks about the clarity. That's an example of an effective, a characteristic of an effective board. And independence is another characteristic of an effective board. Then on responsibilities, key responsibilities, Mr. Adebayo pointed out two key ones. Corporate strategy, being able to determine and oversee corporate strategy, setting the corporate strategy, then ethical and legal compliance. The board is responsible for ensuring ethical and legal compliance. So I believe we have learned a lot from today's webinar, and I believe that we'll also spread the word. You can show Dr. Ewelukwa. Thank you, Mr. Adebayo, for your great insights. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.